Good afternoon, friends, and shalom, and welcome to this episode of the Watchdog exclusively on the Synagogue News. I am your host, CJ Cox, here to tell you that we are living in biblical times. I want to apologize beforehand in case I have to take any breaks or anything like that during this episode. I'm not feeling super swell. I won't bore you guys with the details, but suffice it to say, swell is what I am not feeling. So, if that ends up happening sometime in the future of this episode, I apologize in advance. Um, I appreciate the fact that these are somewhat quote unquote lazy, right? Because as a result of being quote unquote lazy, um, they are a little bit what's the word I'm looking for? I guess easy to do when you're not feeling particularly great. But at any rate, appreciate every single one of you guys who is here. If any of you are here, please remember to like and share this video. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so. Hit that bell to get notified every time that we go live. You can go ahead and follow us on various social media platforms if you fancy. Please do fancy. I am on Facebook, Minds, Parler, Gab, and Twitter. You can find me at the Synagogue on any of those websites. In particular, I would appreciate, although I appreciate you going on any of them, but in particular, I would appreciate being followed on Parler, Gab, and Minds, as we are ardent defenders of alternative social media platforms here. Obviously, there is not much that we can say as far as, like we're not going to get, I don't want to put this, we're not going to be saved as far as our free speech is concerned by, you know, the companies that have already decided they're going to censor us. We're not going to have any reliance upon the government, or at least we shouldn't. What we should do is use alternative social media platforms because they are the ones who we have at least some reason to trust. Recently, Elon Musk has just purchased Twitter, and having purchased Twitter, Elon Musk is now loosening up some of the free speech on the website. It's not quite as bad as it once was, but it's still pretty bad, to be honest. He still is not allowing numerous people who have been censored by the website come back to the website. For example, he has said blatantly that he will not let Alex Jones back on the website. He has not appeared to let not Paul Joseph Watson, the other one, Milo Yiannopoulos back on the website. Gavin McInnes does not appear to be allowed back on the website. We'll see what ends up happening, but there's a couple others as well, Chaim Ben Pisach, and so on and so forth. But he has let some folks back on the website who we did not think would ever be showing back up, right? Like Kanye West, Donald Trump. I think I recently saw Sargon of Akkad, so it was kind of cool. But nevertheless, is he going to be as absolutist in free speech as he said? Doesn't really appear so, especially considering that McInnes, Yiannopoulos, Jones. Say what you will about what they've done outside of their, outside of the Twitter sphere, but they didn't actually violate the terms and conditions that Twitter itself had provided, right? So, nevertheless, this is just my very long way of saying, forget all those guys. Get on Gab, get on Parler, get on Minds. The only way that you can take back internet free speech is by using platforms which will give you internet free speech, right? We don't want the government getting involved. That obviously leads to the government dictating how companies can run themselves. That's not something that we want. We don't want to put our faith in weird, creepy dudes who want to put microchips in everybody like Elon Musk, who also appear to be inconsistent, just for the record, or say, hey, Mark Zuckerberg, I know that you've been Mark Zuckerberg for the last 15 years, but we're going to go ahead and pretend like all of a sudden you're not Mark Zuckerberg and have completely different views than you actually do. Scratch all that and just jump right to, internet free speech on these other platforms. Nevertheless, that was a long-winded way of saying it all. let's go ahead and get to our little history fact of the day I like to share with you guys. On this day in history, that is November the 22nd, today is 2022, but on November the 22nd, 1963, three very famous individuals passed away. The first individual, the one you probably are most aware of, is John F. Kennedy. I don't know if he actually died on the 22nd, or if he was just shot on the 22nd, but I think he was shot and killed the same day that he died. Or excuse me, I think he was shot the same day that he died. I don't think he was like alive at the hospital for a long period of time, but nevertheless, that was November the 22nd, 1963, when JFK was assassinated. That's probably the most famous death on this particular day, but it's not the only one. Aldous Huxley, famous atheist philosopher and writer of the dystopian novel Brave New World, also passed away on November 22nd, 1963. He was 69 years old. I'm not entirely sure how he had passed away, but nevertheless, he did pass away on this day. And lastly, the great C.S. Lewis, so-called, well, first, for those who don't know, I doubt that's many, but for those who don't know, famous Christian theologian, philosopher, and apologist, writer of the Chronicles of Narnia and the Screwtape Letters, as well as the apologetics work Mere Christianity. He passed away on November the 22nd, 1963 as well. Lewis has famously been called the apostle to the skeptics, not, of course, because he got any divine mandate from the Lord, but because he had a way with speaking to those who were atheists, who were agnostics, who were just the religious nons in such a way that really gravitated to them, or maybe that's not the right word. It kind of opened their eyes, I guess, is what I'm trying to get at, though. Mainly because he himself had been an abject God hater before he was converted to Christianity, through a combination of talks with J.R.R. Tolkien, his good friend, and reading G.K. Chesterton's Orthodoxy, as well as, of course, some other things here and there that we won't have time to get into. But nevertheless, all three of these men, Aldous Huxley, C.S. Lewis, and John F. Kennedy, died on the exact same day, November 22nd, 1963. And that was today, 59 years ago. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Nevertheless, that's our little history fact for you guys today. And let's go ahead and jump right into the conversation for today. What I want to talk about briefly before we go on to our articles is Donald Trump. Donald Trump has announced that he will be running for president again in 2024. And there are a couple thoughts I have about Donald Trump running for president in 2024. The first thought that I have about Donald Trump's new run for president is that I don't know how much it necessarily matters. I don't have trust in the federal elections. I think local elections are a lot more trustworthy because it's harder to commit fraud when the people on the ground are really just, the same people who you might go meet on a day-to-day basis, have coffee at their coffee shop, go to their barber shop, whatever it happens to be. And this last election that had passed, I wasn't in any way insinuating that there was fraud. There may or may not have been, but as you guys know, I took the much more reasonable position, in my own view, that it wasn't fraud that lost conservatives the 2022 midterms. Rather, it was the godlessness of our society, as well as a little bit of absolutely ridiculous candidates sprinkled on top. To reiterate, I don't think that we lost in Pennsylvania, for example, Mastriano versus Shapiro in the gubernatorial race. I don't think we lost that because Shapiro had a bunch of fraudulent votes cast in his favor. Nor do I think that we lost that because Mastriano was a bad candidate. Mastriano is actually a very excellent candidate, a candidate I would absolutely have loved to vote for, had I been a Pennsylvanian. Rather, I think we lost that election because Pennsylvania is godless, much like the other 49 states in the country. Now, people might be saying, oh, you lose politically, and so you just think your opponents are godless. And that's not necessarily accurate. It would be one thing if we just lost politically, but it's an entirely different thing to consider who we're losing to. right? People are willingly voting for abortion up to birth. People are willingly voting for grooming in the form of these, drag kids and stuff like that. People are willingly voting for the destruction of marriage. People are willingly voting for the shutdown of internet free speech, the shutdown of freedom of press, the shutdown of our ability to worship freely as we see fit. People are willingly voting for these things, and it has nothing to do with fraud. Okay. Now, I'm not going to say that's always the case. I'm pretty skeptical about what goes on in Arizona. Arizona is not all 50 states. It's also not to say we don't always put forward dumb candidates. Mehmet Oz and Herschel Walker are the two most ridiculous candidates I've seen put forward in quite some time. Although certainly Mitt Romney and even Donald Trump himself have a lot of competition in that regard, or give a lot of competition in that regard, rather. But I don't actually think that's primarily the case. I think, when we look at Mastriano losing in Pennsylvania, when we look at Bundy losing in Idaho, when we look at Laxalt Senator losing in Nevada, when we look at the shooting down of Referendum 131 in Montana, I think that these were actually legitimately voted for by the populace. They actually genuinely want the people who had these lockdowns, who are going to push socialistic policies, who want abortion up to birth, and who want to destroy marriage and all these kinds of things. They legitimately want these people to rule them. That's what the evidence suggests to me, right? Now, all of that being said, that changes a little bit when we start talking about the federal elections. I'm not so sure I trust the federal election process. I don't know for a fact that I don't trust it, but I don't trust it either. You know what I mean? I'm like, I'm not, in other words, I'm not going as far as to say everything is rigged and there's no way anybody can win. I also definitely have my questions. And I think 2020 perfectly encapsulated some of those questions, especially when you consider the fact that some of the areas that appear to be most corrupt, like Arizona and Michigan, and et cetera, are very vitally important swing states. Obviously swing states change from election to election, but in this particular election cycle that just passed, 2020, I mean, the presidential election cycle, those were incredibly important. They appeared to be incredibly corrupt, and they're going to be incredibly important again in 2024. And that creates a little bit of a double-headed monster, because now back to Trump. On one end, I don't know that people want a Republican in office or a conservative in office, regardless of if there's fraud or not. But also, the other head of that monster, I don't know that there won't be any sort of fraud, right? And so that's kind of that double-headed monster makes up the first comment I have on Trump's run in 2024. I don't really know if it matters, because I don't know if the populace really wants to have conservative leaders. And I also don't know that there's any possibility that conservative leaders could get in office in the first place, right? The second problem that I want to address here with Donald Trump running in 2024 is that I don't have faith in Donald Trump. Now, a lot of people get really irritated with my anti-Trump rhetoric, but let me be perfectly frank with you guys. The man is not the conservative darling that you think he is. And 4 years of him being president of the United States demonstrated that. Okay? For example, we talk about inflation here, and certainly the Democrat Congress and President Biden had a lot to do with inflation, but Donald Trump had a lot to do with inflation too. Who sent out the stimulus checks? That was Trump. That was printing a bunch of money that did not exist, spending trillions and adding trillions to our debt. That wasn't Biden. That wasn't Obama. That was Trump who increased our debt by $10 trillion in 4 years. That was Trump who handed out a bunch of free money to people. That was Trump who put Anthony Fauci as the talking head of the government during the COVID crisis, right? That was Trump. That was Trump. That was Trump. Let's just be honest about it, okay? Also, Trump has come out while he was president in support of red flag laws. What are red flag laws? Red flag laws are essentially laws that allow people to come into your home, police, of course, to come into your home and confiscate your weapons without trial by jury because they think you might be a threat to yourself or someone else in clear violation of the Second Amendment. Trump was completely and totally down with that. Let's continue. Back in 2016, when he was running for office, Trump said not only did he think we should waterboard, but we should be doing a hell of a lot worse than that. Now, a lot of people, including myself, think that the United States, given the fact that our Eighth Amendment says we should not be punishing people with cruel and unusual punishment, should not be in the business of torturing people. Trump didn't deny that waterboarding was torturing, like a lot of its supporters would do. Rather, he said that he agreed with that form of torture and that we should be doing worse than that, right? 2020 with the George Floyd riots, Trump did absolutely nothing, right? Now, did the states do absolutely nothing as well? Of course, but he did absolutely nothing also. Now, and we can continue on with this. I'm not saying that he did not do some good things, like removing Title IX, which I think reduced the amount of funding that is given to abortion providers by something like $300 million. Trump did that. That was awesome. Or appointing 3 justices to the Supreme Court who, though I still don't totally trust them, have proven me wrong in so much as they were willing to get rid of Roe v. Wade. And I greatly appreciate that. And I greatly appreciate not only them, but also Trump for appointing them and getting Roe v. Wade overturned, right? And so on and so forth. There are things which Donald Trump did which are good. I'm not saying that his 4 years was a complete waste of time, okay? But what I am saying is I think it behooves us, I guess is what I'm trying to get at, to stay away from these non-conservative candidates because we like their personality and we want somebody to be punched in the face politically and all this other kind of stuff. And it's not like, a lot of the other options are so much better, right? I don't trust DeSantis any more than I trust Trump. I certainly don't trust Mitt Romney, John McCain, who were the 2008 and 2012 nominees before Trump. Okay. I personally, if I had my pick for 2024 Republican nomination, I think Ted Cruz would be good. Rand Paul would be on my short list. Thomas Massie, representative from Kentucky, would be on my short list. I think Ben Carson would be a great candidate. And there's a couple others I could mention as well. But for the most part, it'd be a bunch of people who I don't really trust, no doubt, right? I don't trust Romney. I don't trust DeSantis. I don't trust Trump, so on and so forth, right? Nikki Haley, don't trust her, right? Not sure how I feel about Vice President Pence. Not that he could win the nomination anyways, because everybody hates him. The Trumpists hate him for not going along with Trump during the January 6th thing. And the establishment hates him for being too much of a Tea Partier. And the Democrats hate him because he's a devout Christian. I mean, there's just no chance that Mike Pence could win. But nevertheless, I don't know how I feel about him. He might be good, might not. I don't know. My point is, I don't really trust Donald Trump. I'm a little annoyed that we're going to have to do this all over again, to be honest with you. I said it back in 2016. I begrudgingly voted for him in 2020 because it was either him or what we have now. And, well, we all know how that turned out. But in a perfect world, Trump is not the 2024 candidate, and neither is DeSantis. But we'll get to that at a later episode that is not this episode because, hey, we still got 2 years until that election takes place. Anyways, friends, apologies for the pauses here. Like I said, I am not feeling particularly great, so I might be a little off my game today. Appreciate you guys who are dealing with it. I want to say shalom to Kevin and Yahoo in the live chat right now. Please remember to like and share the video. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so. Hit the bell to get notified every time we go live. Let's get right into our articles for today. You can see by my title, Disrespect for Marriage Act or Colorado Springs will be more commoner. And yes, I did mean to say will be more commoner. I know it sounds ridiculous. It's supposed to sound ridiculous. So I hope that you guys appreciate my sense of humor here. And if you don't, well, guess what? It's my show. But at any rate, um, so recently the so-called Respect for Marriage Act, which is recent, which is really a Disrespect for Marriage Act, has been passed by the Senate. Um, this Respect for Marriage Act basically codifies in federal law homosexual marriage as well as interracial marriage, but we'll get to why I think the interracial marriage part of this is just a dud, meant to distract from the actual issues. Nevertheless, um, this act I think is well, we'll get into the details of it here in just a minute because, as you can see by my headliner now, I'm saying what is the Respect for Marriage Act? But suffice it to say, it is an affront, I think, to what the concept of marriage actually is. But there was also recently a shooting, very tragic, don't get me wrong. Obviously, I disagree with the sin of the homosexual community. However, I believe that we are all sinners saved by grace. I don't want them to be massacred in mass any more than I want all the adulterers to be massacred in mass. I would like them to be saved, but I digress. Um, Tragically, a bunch of people were killed in a Colorado Springs gay bar. Now, it was a gay bar, so people are thinking this is probably some sort of a targeted attack against the homosexuals, right? And basically, the leftist logic goes, if you don't support the Respect for Marriage Act, then you're somehow, 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon responsible for the shooting that happened in Colorado Springs. So what we're going to do in this episode, we're going to go over what is the Respect for Marriage Act, what exactly does it do? Then we're going to look at the details of the shooting. Then we are going to go over the ridiculous claim that you are somehow responsible for the shooting because you don't support homosexual marriage, which is, of course, absolutely ridiculous. But it is the current talking point, and these talking points are only going to get worse, friends. We're already kind of used to it, of course, right? You're anti-woman if you don't want women to be able to kill their babies in the womb. You obviously want gay people to die if you think homosexuality is a sin. You obviously think that you have control over women if you think that marriage is a good thing. All these other kinds of ridiculous things the Democrats like to claim and the liberals try to claim, and even a lot of the establishment Republicans try to claim these days. We'll get to that. But nevertheless, let's go ahead and get into the details here. By the way, Yahoo, greatly appreciate the comment here. And I am very happy to have you here with us, friend. So let's get right into this. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Microsoft Edge tab. 117th Congress. Here we are here. Okay, so this is HR 8404, Respect for Marriage Act. Sponsor was Representative Gerald Nadler from New York. Let's see. Go ahead and go over some of the details here. So it passed the House on the 19th of July, 2022. And it just recently passed the Senate, I think like 3 days ago. Might have been about a week ago, but nevertheless, it has passed both. It's going to be codified, and there's absolutely no chance at all that Joe Biden does not sign it. Brief overview. The bill provides statutory. Let me go ahead and zoom in so you guys can read it as well. I don't know how many of you guys actually read my screens, but I assume it's at least some of you because I get requests to zoom in. This bill provides statutory authority for same-sex and interracial marriages. Specifically, the bill repeals and replaces provisions that define, for purposes of federal law, marriages between a man and a woman and a spouse as a person of the opposite sex, with provisions that recognize any marriage that is valid under state law. Parentheses, the Supreme Court held that the current provisions were unconstitutional in United States v. Windsor, 2013. The bill also repeals and replaces provisions that do not require states to recognize same-sex marriage from other states with provisions that prohibit the denial of full faith and credit or any right or claim relating to out-of-state marriages on the basis of sex, race, ethnicity, or national origin. The Supreme Court held that state laws barring same-sex marriage were unconstitutional in Obergefell v. Hodges in 2015. The court held that state laws barring interracial marriages were unconstitutional in Loving v. Virginia, 1967. The bill allows the Department of Justice to bring a civil action and establish a private right of action for violations. Okay, so a couple things before we get into more of the details here. First thing, you notice that this bill provides statutory authority for same-sex and interracial marriages. This is a very common tactic that the liberals like to use. The bill is about same-sex marriages, okay? But if they add the interracial marriage aspect in there, then when you vote against it, they can say, oh, so you don't support white people marrying black people? And of course, that's a sneaky little tactic they use because they know what the bill's about. They know what they're trying to push forward. They know what people are rejecting when they reject it. But nevertheless, because they have added that little thing here about interracial marriages, they can always claim, oh, well, did you know that Mitch McConnell's married to an Asian and he voted against the Respect for Marriage Act, which means he must not actually support marriage of white people to Asians. Of course, that's not true, right? It's complete and total hogwash, but it's a tactic. And it's a very common tactic you'll see all of the time. Like, so for example, a lot of people would, I can't have I don't have a bill off the top of my head, unfortunately, so I do apologize for that. But you'll often see these ads where somebody will say, my opponent, and this is during the election cycle, so my opponent voted against, HR thus and such and the other, 27-BA apostrophe X. I don't know. I don't care. And it included this provision that said that nobody should be allowed to cut rabbits' toes off. And so obviously my opponent agrees with cutting off rabbits' toes. I don't know if rabbits have toes, but nonetheless, I assume they do. Nevertheless, you get the idea, right? And of course, what they don't tell you is that the bill is got all these earmarks that talk about, subsidies for this, that, and the third company, or that it's going to allow people to be able to spy on you, or whatever it happens to be. But that little provision about cutting off rabbits' toes allows me to say during the election cycle that my opponent supports cutting off rabbits' toes. And this is the same thing that you have going on here. Nobody in the entire Congress, there are 435 members of the House of Representatives, there are 100 members of the Senate. Not a single person who voted against this bill was voting against it because they did not agree with interracial marriages. Literally, not one. There's probably nobody watching this video who disagrees with interracial marriages. Obviously, some of you might. I don't think that that's a completely dead belief, but for the most part, it's a dead belief. But nevertheless, right, this is just a tactic that is used to try and smear people who disagree with what you are trying to put forward. We all know that this bill, excuse me, is meant to codify same-sex marriage, not interracial marriage. But adding interracial marriage will allow everybody to say, that guy doesn't support interracial marriage. Don't you know he voted against the Respect for Marriage Act? So that's the first thing. Okay. The second thing is that you see the bill repeals and replaces provisions that define, for purposes of federal law, marriage as between a man and a woman, and spouse as a person of the opposite sex, with provisions that recognize any marriage that is valid under state law. Okay, so essentially, this bill redefines what marriage actually is. Okay, marriage is the union, the God-ordained union of a man and a woman to each other for life. It is meant to be monogamous. It is meant to be permanent. It is meant to be heterosexual. Okay. The Lord does not look fondly upon polyamory or divorce or homosexuality. That is just simply a fact. And he's the one who ordained the institution. And virtually every society that has ever existed agrees with this ordaining, not necessarily because they all have good revelation from God, but because this is one of those things which we see described in Romans 1, is kind of revealed by natural revelation, right? Boys and girls make little boys and girls when they come together in a union. Boys and boys do not make little boys when they come together in a union, and neither do girls and girls make little girls, right? Pretty simple science there. And as a result, people have just sort of recognized the fact that yes, marriage is between a man and a woman. Obviously, people have for a long time had homosexual relationships. I'm not saying that this is somehow brand new, but obviously, we can just see by basic biology that it's not something that's normal. And so these guys have just decided they're going to fundamentally redefine marriage and what marriage actually is. And that's basically the point of this bill. Now, I want to take a brief stop here to examine this United States v. Windsor, which was basically, as you even saw there in that bill, was a ruling by the Supreme Court that said the definition of marriage is between a man and a woman was unconstitutional. This is 2013. Let's read a little bit about this. This is just the Wikipedia page. We're not going to go too deep into it. Which, by the way, if you guys are interested in deep study of these kinds of things, Wikipedia may not be the best, but if you want a general overview of something, Wikipedia is perfectly fine. People should not be source shaming over the fact that you use Wikipedia. But at any rate, United States v. Windsor, 570 U.S. 744, 2013, is a landmark United States Supreme Court civil rights case concerning same-sex marriage. The court held that Section 3 of the Defense of Marriage Act, which denied federal recognition of same-sex marriages, was a violation of the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment. I'll say that again. They ruled that Section 3 of the Defense of Marriage Act, which denied federal recognition of same-sex marriages, was a violation of the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment. Now, very briefly, in case you guys aren't familiar with your constitutional law, let's look at what the Due Process Clause is. In United States constitutional law, a due process clause is found in both the Fifth and 14th Amendments of the United States Constitution, which prohibits arbitrary deprivation of life, liberty, or property by the government except as authorized by law. The U.S. Supreme Court interprets these clauses broadly, concluding that they provide three protections: procedural due process in civil and criminal proceedings, substantive due process, a prohibition against vague laws, and as the vehicle for the incorporation of the Bill of Rights. Okay, let's look at the text real quick. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That's Fifth Amendment. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That's 14th Amendment. Okay. You can see here that it actually gives you a quote from Clause 39 of the Magna Carta. No free man shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his rights or possessions, or outlawed or exiled or deprived of his standing in any other way, nor will we proceed with force against him or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. All right, so you know what the due process clause is now. According to United States versus Windsor, recognizing marriage as between a man and a woman violates the due process clause. Does that make sense? Well, of course it doesn't make sense, but who said the Supreme Court needed to make any sense? I mean, after all, these are the same guys who voted that it was cruel and unusual punishment to execute a pedophile in 2008. See Louisiana v. Kennedy. I did not make that up. Nevertheless, continuing, Edith Windsor and Thea Spire, a same-sex couple residing in New York, had their marriage recognized by the state of New York in 2008. Spire died in 2009, leaving her entire estate to Windsor. Windsor sought to claim the federal estate tax exemption for surviving spouses, but was barred from doing so by Section 3 of DOMA, which is that Defense of Marriage Act. Seeking a refund, Windsor sued the federal government in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York. As the Department of Justice declined to defend the constitutionality of Section 3 of DOMA, the Bipartisan Legal Advisory Group, or BLAG, intervened to defend the law. District Judge Barbara S. Jones ruled that Section 3 of DOMA was unconstitutional, and her ruling was affirmed by the U.S. Court, of Appeals for the Second Circuit. 1 second, I gotta let my dog out. All right. Scrolling down here. 1 second, friends. I apologize. All right. The Supreme Court granted certiorari in December 2012 and handed down its judgment on June 26, 2013. In the majority opinion, which was joined by 4 other justices, Justice Anthony Kennedy declared Section 3 of DOMA to be unconstitutional as a deprivation, of the liberty of the person protected by the Fifth Amendment. Again, he said it was a deprivation of the liberty of the person protected by the Fifth Amendment. He further wrote, quote, "The federal statute is invalid for no legitimate purpose overcomes the purpose and effect to disparage and to injure those whom the state, by its marriage laws, sought to protect in personhood and dignity," end quote. 4 justices filed dissenting opinions, including Justice Anton Scalia, who argued that the court, quote, "had no power under the Constitution to invalidate this democratically adopted legislation," end quote. On the same day, the court also issued a separate 5-4 decision in Hollingsworth v. Perry that effectively allowed same-sex marriage in California to resume. Following the decision, the Obama administration began to extend other federal rights, privileges, and benefits to married same-sex couples. 2 years later, in the case of Obergefell v. Hodges, the court struck down all state bans on same-sex marriage, ruling that marriage is guaranteed to same-sex couples by both the Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clause. Okay. Before I get into some of my own opinions here, which I think you already know some of them, such as the fact that it's just a ridiculous use of the Due Process Clause, let's go ahead and read what the opinions actually were. So, in a 5-4 decision issued on June 26, 2013, the Supreme Court found Section 3 of DOMA codified as 1 U.S. Code Section 7, or I think that's paragraph 7, but nevertheless, to be unconstitutional, quote, "as a deprivation of liberty of the person protected by the Fifth Amendment," end quote. The court held that the Constitution prevented the federal government from treating state-sanctioned heterosexual marriages differently from state-sanctioned same-sex marriages, and that such differentiation, quote, "demanded the couple whose moral and sexual choices the Constitution projects," or demeaned the couple, whose moral and sexual choices the Constitution protects. Justice Anthony Kennedy authored the majority opinion, joined by Justices Ginsburg, Breyer, Sotomayor, and Kagan. Kennedy's decision to strike down a central part of DOMA cited the principles of state autonomy, equal protection, and liberty. Super ironic, considering that not 2 years later, they would go ahead and strike down the ability for a state to actually have its own autonomy in deciding whether or not they would recognize same-sex marriages. And I'm talking, of course, about Obergefell v. Hodges. But the constitutional basis for striking down the law was not entirely clear, as it had elements of federalism, equal protection, and due process. Wikipedia itself admits that it was not entirely clear. The answer may be found in Windsor's brief, in which she argued that DOMA operates to say that married gay couples aren't genuinely married at all, but are instead similarly situated to unmarried peoples. And of course, if marriage is defined as between a man and a woman, that is just simply true. You can't have a marriage between 2 men if the marriage is defined as a union between a man and a woman. Now, the court wrote, DOMA seeks to injure the very class New York seeks to protect. By doing so, it violates basic due process and equal protection principles applicable to the federal government. See U.S. Constitution Amendment 5, and also the case of Bowling v. Sharp, which was ruled in 1954. When New York adopted a law to permit same-sex marriage, it sought to eliminate inequality, but DOMA frustrates that objective through a system-wide enactment with no identified connection to any particular area of federal law. DOMA writes inequality into the entire United States Code. This particular case at hand concerns the estate tax, but DOMA is more than a simple determination of what should or should not be allowed as an estate tax refund. Among the other 1,000 statutes and numerous federal regulations, the DOMA controls are laws pertaining to Social Security, housing, taxes, criminal sanctions, copyright, and veterans' benefits. DOMA's principal effect is to identify a subset of state-sanctioned marriages and make them unequal. The principal purpose is to impose inequality not for other reasons like government efficiency, governmental efficiency, excuse me, responsibilities as well as rights enhance the dignity and integrity of the person, and DOMA contrives to deprive some couples married under the laws of their state, but not to others, but not other couples, excuse me, of both rights and responsibilities. By creating two contradictory marriage regimes within the same state, DOMA forces same-sex couples to live as married for the purposes of state law, but unmarried for the purposes of federal law, thus diminishing the stability and predictability of basic personal relations the state has found it proper to acknowledge and protect. By this, and scrolling down here, sorry. By this dynamic, DOMA undermines both the public and private significance of state-sanctioned same-sex marriages, for it tells those couples and all the world that their otherwise valid marriages are unworthy of federal recognition. This places same-sex couples in an unstable position of being in second-tier marriage. The differentiation demeans the couple whose moral and sexual choices the Constitution protects, although obviously I don't know where. The Constitution does not say you have the right to marry anybody that you see fit. Now, of course, I don't believe that the government should be involved in issuing marriage licenses, as I've said before. But nevertheless, we are in a world where they are involved in issuing marriage licenses, and so we continue. In whose relationship the state has sought to dignify, and it humiliates tens of thousands of children now being raised by same-sex couples. The law in question makes it even more difficult for the children to understand the integrity and closeness of their own family and its concord with other families in their community and in their daily lives. Now, before we continue on with anything else here, I would like to point out that this ruling would effectively, essentially it's saying it's a violation of the due process clause to not recognize same-sex marriages, which means by the same logic, it would be a violation of the due process clause or equal protection clauses, as Obergefell v. Hodges would also conclude, to not recognize other forms of marriage between consenting individuals, such as incestuous marriages, polygamous marriages, and you could even argue marriages to children. Why would I argue that? Well, because certain states already have incredibly low ages of consent. And no, I'm not talking about the age of 16 that your state likely has, as nearly half of all states in the union have an age of consent of 16. I'm talking about states like Alabama, which do not have an age of consent, or California, whose age of consent is 14. You can look that up for yourself if you don't believe me. Marriages in these areas would effectively have to be, the nation would have to recognize them under this interpretation of the due process clause and under this interpretation, or under the interpretation given in Obergefell v. Hodges of the equal protections clause, because not recognizing these marriages would be depriving somebody of liberty without due process of the courts. That's what the court here is saying. And if you don't think it's going to go that way, well, then I have a bridge to sell you, my friend, because we're already down the slippery slope. We'll go ahead and break from this for a minute because I want to, for the sake of time, go to Scalia's dissent and then go back to the Defense of Marriage Act, or Respect for Marriage Act. All right, Justice Scalia, this is Anton Scalia. Justice Scalia's dissent, which was joined by in full by Justice Thomas and in part by Chief Justice Roberts, opened, quote, "This case is about power in several respects. It is about the power of our people to govern themselves and the power of this court to pronounce the law. Today's opinion aggrandizes the latter and, with the predictable consequence of diminishing the former. We have no power to decide this case, and even if we did, we have no power under the Constitution to invalidate this democratically adopted legislation." It's a shame that Anton Scalia is no longer with us. He continued, "Windsor's injury was cured by the judgment in her favor. What the petitioner United States asks us to do in this case before us is exactly, what the petitioner United States asks us to do in this case before us is exactly what the respondent Windsor asks us to do. Not to provide relief from the judgment below, but to say that the judgment was correct. And the same was true in the Court of Appeals. Neither party sought to undo the judgment for Windsor, and so that court should have dismissed the appeal just as we should dismiss for lack of jurisdiction." End quote. Scalia argued that the judgment effectively characterized opponents of same-sex marriage as enemies of the human race. Quote, It is one thing for a society to elect change. It is another for a court of law to impose change by adjudging those who oppose it hostis humani generis, enemies of the human race. He argued that the court's ruling would affect state bans on same-sex marriage as well, which of course in 2 years ended up being true. As far as the court is concerned, no one should be fooled. It is just a matter of listening and waiting for the other shoe. By formally declaring anyone opposed to same-sex marriage as an enemy of human decency, the majority arms well every challenger to a state law restricting marriage to its traditional definition, end quote. Scalia concluded by saying the Supreme Court, quote, has cheated both sides, robbing the winners of an honest victory and the losers of the peace that comes from a fair defeat, end quote. All right, so excuse me, let me get a drink of my coffee here. That's a little bit about Windsor, United States v. Windsor, which ruled that the federal government recognizing marriage as defined between a man and a woman was unconstitutional, and which effectively was violated by Bergefeld v. Hodges 2 years later, as it was based on the idea of state autonomy to make its own laws. In other words, New York wants to recognize same-sex marriage. They should have a right to do so. But Bergefeld v. Hodges, of course, would say Texas does not want to recognize same-sex marriage, and they don't have a right to do so. So, turns out the court is inconsistent. What do you know about that? Shocking. Back to the Defense of Marriage Act, or Respect of Marriage Act, excuse me. We're not talking about DOMA, we're talking about Roma. Ha 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 ha. All right, we're not going to read the entire bill, of course, but we are going to read a good portion of what we have here. So this is the text portion. I'll drop this in the live chat in case anybody wants to read about this for themselves. H.R. 8404 to repeal the Defense of Marriage Act and ensure respect for state regulation of marriage and for other purposes. Received, read the first time, read the second time, and placed on the calendar, and then it gives the dates. An act to repeal the Defense of Marriage Act and ensure respect for state regulation, of marriage and for other purposes, be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America and Congress assembled. Section 1, short title, this act may be cited as the Respect for Marriage Act. Section 2, repeal of section added to Title 28, United States Code by Section 2 of the Defense of Marriage Act. Section 1738C of Title 28 United States Code is repealed. Section 3, full faith and credit given to marriage equality. Chapter 115 of Title 28 United States Code, as amended by this act, is further amended by inserting their Section 1738B the following. In general, no person acting under color of state law may deny full faith and credit to any public act, record, or judicial proceeding of any other state pertaining to a marriage between two individuals on the basis of sex, race, ethnicity, or national origin of those individuals, or a right, or a right or claim arising from such a marriage on the basis that such marriage would not be recognized under the law of the state, or on the basis of the sex, race, ethnicity, or national origin of those individuals. Enforcement by Attorney General. The Attorney General may bring a civil action in the appropriate United States District Court against any person who violates subsection A for declaratory or injunctive relief. In other words, the federal government will be able to bring a civil suit against those who refuse to go along with the Respect for Marriage Act. C, private right of action. Any person who is harmed by a violation of subsection A may bring a civil action in the appropriate United States District Court against the person who violated such subsection for declaratory and injunctive relief. D, state defined. In this section, the term state has the meaning given such order under Section 7 of Title 1. Section 4, marriage recognition. Marriage. For the purposes of any federal law, rule, or regulation in which marital status is a factor, an individual shall be considered married if that individual's marriage is valid in the state where the marriage was entered into, or in the case of a marriage entered into outside any state, if the marriage is valid in the place wherein entered into, and the marriage could have been entered into in a state. By the way, I see a question in the live chat from Richard Neal. First off, Shalom, thank you for being here. Also, Kelvy Shalom, thank you for being here. This has passed. It has passed both the Senate and the House of Representatives. We are currently just waiting for it to be signed by President Biden. And of course, there is basically a 0% chance that he won't sign it. So notice here it says, for the purposes of any federal law, rule, or regulation in which marital status is a factor, an individual shall be considered married if that individual's marriage is valid in the state where the marriage was entered into, or in the case of a marriage entered into outside any state, if the marriage is valid in the place where entered into and the marriage could have been entered into in a state. Okay, so what was I talking about earlier as far as brother-sister marriages, or as far as marriages between multiple persons, or as far as marriages between people who are younger than the age of consent and somebody who is not younger than or who have a very young age of consent. I say younger than the age of consent, but technically that wouldn't apply because in those states where you could, quote, be younger, there just isn't an age of consent, right? Like I was saying earlier. But then also you, of course, have states like California where the age of consent is just absurdly low, namely 14, provided that there is no more than a 10-year difference. In other words, I'm 24 right now. If I wanted to in the state of California, I could go marry and have sex with a 14-year-old. And if you just vomited a little bit in your mouth, don't worry, I'm not planning on doing such a thing. But nevertheless, I have legal right to do so in the state of California. I'm not kidding, by the way. That is actually the law in California. Look it up for yourself. It's a 10-year difference law. If you are no older than the age of 24, you may have relations with somebody who is as young as 14. Not kidding. And according to this bill, the federal government would have to recognize it as well. And it would have to recognize any polygamous marriages or polyamorous marriages, and it would have to recognize any incestuous marriages. And we're not talking about something like your third cousin or something like that. I mean, in this particular regard, it'd be any marriage that is recognized by that state. So long as the state recognizes your right to marry your older sister, well, the federal government has no right to not recognize that. And by the way, given what we just read in United States v. Windsor, which said that it was a violation of the Due Process Clause to not recognize same-sex marriages, it is only a matter of time before incestuous marriages are in fact forcibly recognized. So essentially, this bill, combined with the Bergefeld v. Hodges and United States v. Windsor, has guaranteed there is no way for us to get out of it. We're just simply waiting for it to manifest. But the seed is planted. It will be a thing for people to be entered into polygamous marriages, incestuous marriages, and marriages with people who are younger than the commonly accepted ages of consent, which are typically either 16 or 18. It's going to happen. Mark my words, it is going to happen. The laws are already on the books. The court rulings have already been made. In this section, the term state means a state, the District of Columbia, the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, or any other territory or possession of the United States. The purposes of subsection A in determining whether marriage is valid in the state or the place where entered into, if outside of any state, only the law of the jurisdiction applicable at the time the marriage was entered into may be considered. Severability, section 5. If any provision of this act or any amendment made by this act or the application of such provisions to any person, entity, government, or circumstance is held to be unconstitutional, the remainder of this act or any amendment made thereby or the application of such provision to all other persons, entities, governments, or circumstances shall not be affected thereby. In other words, if you said we broke the rules in one element of this bill, that doesn't mean you get to throw out the rest of the bill, which I'm not even sure that that in and of itself is constitutional. Pretty sure that's an underhanded tactic that itself might be unconstitutional, but I digress on that. It's almost like saying, hey, if I cheated to get this championship, then you're not allowed to take away anything that, so like, let's say somebody took steroids in a baseball championship, right? You say, okay, well, they took steroids, but that doesn't mean you're able to invalidate what the other 8 players did. Well, I am, though, because you're all part of a team, and the team is what won the series, not the individual who took the steroids. But at any rate, I digress on that. All right, so we could go in further, but you guys get the idea. The state must recognize same-sex marriages. Marriage has now been defined as a union between two persons as recognized by their individual state. And of course, their individual state is not allowed to recognize a marriage, only not allowed to restrict recognition of marriage to between a man and a woman, given to Bergefeld v. Hodges in the United States v. Windsor. So this is all just a big circle that says it has been that same-sex marriage has been federally codified. Okay. All on the same page here, right? Real briefly, I'd just like to point out that there were 12 GOP senators who ended up agreeing with this bill. They are Susan Collins of Maine, Rob Portman of Ohio, Tom Tillis of North Carolina, Roy Blunt of Missouri, Richard Burr of North Carolina, Shelley Moore Capito of West Virginia, Cynthia Loomis of Wyoming, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, Mitt Romney of Utah, Dan Sullivan of Alaska, Todd Young of Indiana, Joni Ernst of Iowa. Those are the 12 Republican senators who voted yes on this bill. So if you live in any of those states, you know that's who your guys are. Again, this is Ernst, Iowa, Young, Indiana, Sullivan, Alaska, Murkowski, Alaska, Romney, Utah, Loomis, Wyoming, excuse me, Capito, West Virginia, Burr, North Carolina, Blunt, Missouri, and Collins in Maine. Oh, and Portman in Ohio and Tillis in North Carolina. Sorry. I probably should have written the list here of the United States representatives who were Republican and voted yes on it as well. But nevertheless, that's what the Defense of Marriage Act is. Hope that was clear enough for you guys. Now, there was a shooting in a Colorado gay bar that killed 5. Very tragic. We are not here to glory in the death of 5 individuals, even if they were in the process of doing a thing which we disagree with and find to be sinful, right? We're not Muslims here. We are Christians. Christians obviously do not glory in the death of individuals, even individuals who are actively partaking in sin. Nevertheless, in Colorado Springs, Colorado, a gay bar was shot up. 5 were killed, 18 were wounded. Let's go ahead and read a little bit about that. Gunman kills 5 at LGBTQ nightclub in Colorado Springs before patrons confront and stop him, police say. It's written by Eric Levinson, Michelle Watson, Andy Rose, and Amir Vera. Which I don't know why you need 4 people to read or to write an article, but nevertheless, this is certainly not news, so I guess I'm not really surprised. A 22-year-old gunman, whose motive has not yet been identified, by the way, entered an LGBTQ nightclub in Colorado Springs, Colorado, just before midnight Saturday and immediately opened fire, killing at least 5 people and injuring 25 others. So I guess the number of those injured has gone up since I last read, which of course makes sense in so much as that not all of the injuries are identified first time the stories are being published. Before patrons confronted and stopped him, police said Sunday. The suspect in the shooting at Club Q was identified as Anderson Lee Aldrich, according to Colorado Springs Police Chief Adrian Vasquez. He used a long rifle in the shooting and 2 firearms were found at the scene, Vasquez said. At least 2 people inside the club confronted and fought the gunman and prevented further violence, Vasquez said. Quote, "We owe them a great debt of thanks," end quote, he said. And of course, while not endorsing anything about the gay lifestyle here, I do want to point out that there certainly is heroic to risk your lives to stop somebody who is actively shooting, in a crowded area. So I don't want to take anything away from, any of the people who had done this, right? Let's see. At least 2 people inside. No. Police said they were investigating whether the attack was a hate crime and noted Club Q's relationship with the LGBTQ community. Quote, "Club Q is a safe haven for the LGBTQ citizens," end quote, Vasquez said. Quote, "Every citizen has a right to feel safe and secure in our city, to go about our beautiful city without fear of being harmed or treated poorly," end quote. In a statement on social media, Club Q said it was, quote, "devastated by the senseless attack on our community," end quote, and thanked, quote, "the quick reaction of heroic customers that subdued the gunman and ended this hate attack," end quote. Club Q posted earlier in the day that its Saturday night lineup would feature a punk and alternative show at 9 p.m., followed by a dance party at 11. The club also planned to hold a drag brunch and drag show on Sunday for Transgender Day of Remembrance, which I guess is a thing. The club's website now says it will be closed until further notice. Governor Jared Polis ordered flags lowered to half staff at all public buildings statewide to honor the victims of the mass shooting beginning Monday until Saturday, according to a news release from his office. Quote, flags will be lowered for 5 days to remember each of the 5 individuals who lost their lives in the senseless tragedy, the release card read. To further honor and remember the victims of those injured in this tragedy, the Polish Primavera administration will also be flying the pride flag at the Colorado State Capitol for the next few days, end quote, which of course is completely absurd. And here I don't mean to be disrespectful. However, when there was a shooting in Texas in a church that killed 20, and wounded 26. David Patrick Kelly shot up the church. Nobody was putting forward Christian symbols on their government buildings, right? Nobody was raising up the Christian flag, which is technically a thing, by the way. It's that white flag with the little blue square in the upper left-hand corner, and it's got a red cross on it. Nobody was raising up that flag on the day that 20 individuals lost their lives in a church being attacked by somebody who was, by the admission of not only himself, but also his Facebook page, which I put it that way because he admitted it to the police and also had spoken about this kind of stuff earlier, was a rabid atheist whose purpose in shooting this place up was to kill many Christians. And by the way, I'm not even saying necessarily that there should have been the flag raised. That's not my point. My point here is just to say that when 20 Christians die in a mass shooting at a church, well, there's no raising of a Christian flag. There's no 20 days of remembrance. There's no, everybody who is against Christianity is to blame for this. But when 5 individuals who are homosexual die at a bar, then there is 5 days of remembrance, and there is the raising of an LGBTQ flag and all this other kind of stuff. Almost seems like propaganda, but hey, what do I know? Anyways, the shooting came as the calendar turned to Transgender Day of Remembrance on Sunday and is reminiscent of the 2016 attack at an LGBTQ nightclub in Orlando, Florida, in which a gunman, who was a Muslim, by the way, who pledged allegiance to the Islamic State, killed 49 people and wounded at least 53. Colorado has been the site of some of the most heinous mass shootings in U.S. history, including a 1999 shooting in Columbine High School and the 2012 movie theater shooting in Aurora. Colorado Springs was the site of mass shootings at a Planned Parenthood in November 2015 that left 3 dead, and at a birthday party last year that left 6 dead. All right, so we can continue on, but you get the idea. A bunch of people died, obviously tragic, but the state is deciding to turn this into an opportunity to propagandize. And so is everybody else who is on the left as well. And this is where we get to the sort of cream of the crop here, right? Support the former, namely the Respect for Marriage Act, or be blamed for the latter, namely the shooting at the Colorado Springs nightclub Q. That is what the left is currently presenting us with. Now I'm going to go ahead and show you some of the stuff that I have shared here on my Twitter page where people are saying precisely this. So here is April Ajoy, who is allegedly a Christian, got a pretty big following here on Twitter, says, Colorado Springs, demonizing queer people leads to violent deaths. Unaffirming theology enables hate crimes. It's not enough to be silent to avoid controversy. Our queer siblings are being killed and harmed every day. If you care for your LGBTQ loved ones, be loud. So notice here that she says unaffirming theology enables hate crimes. If you believe that Leviticus 18:22 or Romans 1:26 through 27 or 1 Corinthians 6 through 9 are actually something that you should follow, considering the fact that they're, in the Bible, then you are enabling hate crimes. You are enabling hate crimes. It's your fault that 5 people died in a Colorado Springs mass shooting. Not the shooter's fault. No, it's your fault that this actually happened, right? And I, of course, posted here, remember, kids, if your theology conforms to Scripture, it means you're the one responsible for 5 deaths in a nightclub. It's true. The internet lady said so. And, of course, the internet lady did said so. And so obviously we are all supposed to comply. Claps, golf claps all around. Good job. So stunning, so brave. Apparently it's my fault because I decided that the Bible actually means something. And this so-called Christian who decides that the Bible doesn't mean anything gets to just declare that that is so. This person, David Wiseman, another popular person here in the Twitterverse. Lauren Boebert's own words, inciting the hate towards the LGBTQ community. She is not directly responsible, but she is an enabler as those who voted for her. So you're an enabler to the killing of 5 people if indeed you are affirming what the scripture teaches. If you affirm what the scripture teaches, then in fact you are enabling the killing of 5 individuals. It's your fault. It's Lauren Boebert's fault, not the guy who actually pulled the trigger's fault, but your fault. Right? We continue here with some more. Candace Owens makes a good point here where she says, I just want to make sure I'm correct in understanding that the left is using the tragedy in Colorado Springs to make the argument that unless conservatives get on board with experimenting on children's genitals with puberty blockers, then nightclub shootings will continue to happen. And of course, that's exactly what they're saying. Excuse me. What do we have here? Aaron Green, Masters of Divinity, says, affirming theology saves lives, non-affirming theology kills them. Why is this so hard for people to understand? Again, it is the non-affirming theology. You who do not believe that homosexuality is cohesive with biblical Christianity, your theology is what kills these people. No, not the person who actually brought the rifle into the club and fired upon folks. Not Democratic politicians who refused to put this person in prison a year ago when he had already been charged with violent crimes. It's your fault. Why? Because you believe Leviticus 18:22 is a reveal of God. You believe 1 Corinthians 6-9 is revealed, or 9-11, excuse me, is revealed of God. You believe that Romans 1:26-27 is revealed of God. And we could continue on, of course. Conservative Christians are worried about losing the ability to discriminate against LGBTQ folks with impunity. LGBTQ are worried about getting murdered. Of course, my response here is every group gets murdered. Quit pretending you're unique. And we can just go on and on and on and on with it. What is the point? The point is that we, as those who disagree with homosexual marriage, who think that the scripture stands just as true in 2022 as it did when it was written, whether that be in the 1400s BC by Moses, or whether that be in the 50s AD by Paul. It is just as true today as it was back then. But apparently, if you believe that it's just as true today as it was back then, you are actually responsible. You heard them. Affirming theology saves lives, but non-affirming theology kills them. Now, let's keep in mind here that the motives of the individual in question have not been published, for one. For two, even if they were published, you guys would not be responsible for it, being as that you literally didn't do it, right? Number 3, the person here is not known to have any ties to any Christian churches, is not known to have any ties to conservative groups or anything like that, right? None of that stuff. It's your fault. It's your fault. Which is completely ridiculous. It's completely absurd. But nevertheless, this is what's going to continue to happen as we continue forward with everything here. Now, you recall I was talking about the Texas church shooting that happened a couple years back. You can go ahead and give some details about that. It was the Sutherland Springs church shooting. Maybe you guys remember that. Devin Patrick Kelly on November 5th, 2017, murdered 26 people, wounded 22 others, eventually ended up killing himself. excuse me, murdered 26 people, 5 times the amount of people who died in this nightclub plus 1. Okay. He was a rabid atheist. He was an Antifa supporter. He was somebody who had been arrested for domestic violence previously, but had not actually been put in prison because, for whatever reason, we don't like to punish criminals anymore. And he murdered 22 individuals in the Sutherland Springs church. 22 individuals who were all Protestant Christian. Question. Specifically Baptist, by the way. Question. If you don't affirm Protestant Christian theology, are you responsible for the deaths of 22 individuals? We know Devin Patrick Kelly's motive. He was angry at his mother who attended the church. He was a rabid atheist, and he was a supporter of Antifa. So we know precisely what possessed him to shoot up this church. And he killed 22 people. I don't know if you know how to do math, but 22 is bigger than 5. In fact, if you add with the wounded, 22 plus 20 wounded, excuse me, you have 42 total casualties. 42 total casualties comparatively to a total of 30 in this last one. Now, I'm not trying to sit here and play the math game entirely, right? That's not the point here. The point is one of these attacks is deadlier than the other. One of these attacks has a known motive. One of these attacks has somebody who had demonstrated hatred for the individuals whom he shot up. Does that mean that all non-Protestant Christians are responsible for the killing of 22 individuals in Sutherland Springs First Baptist Church? And if you say no, that's completely ridiculous. I didn't pull the trigger, excuse me. Congratulations. Then you know why it's completely ridiculous for you to start saying non-affirming theology is somehow responsible for the death of 5 individuals at Club Q. That not supporting the Disrespect for Marriage Act, that not supporting puberty blockers for children is somehow responsible for the murder of 5 individuals at Club Q. It's completely absurd. Completely absurd. But at any rate, friends, this is just the world that we live in. This is just the world that we live in. These individuals are going to continuously blame you as Christians for every little thing that happens negatively to one of their people. Okay? Something bad happens to a gay person. Something bad happens to a single woman. Something bad happens to a transgender person. Something bad happens to any of these groups of people. It is going to be your fault. And there's likely going to be some retaliation. Not now. We're not quite there yet. But eventually, there certainly will be. Whether that be legal retaliation, such as hate crime legislation, or whether that be some form of physical retaliation, which I am happy to say we're not yet at that point. It's going to happen. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind. Now, am I an expert in these things? No. But I'm pretty good at reading the tea leaves, so to speak. I think a lot of you guys already know that, which is why you're consistently watching this program. And every time somebody starts throwing in your face, well, you're not affirming, did you not know what happened in Colorado Springs? You can always just throw back at them, oh, well, so you're not a Christian. Did you not know what happened in Sutherland Springs First Baptist Church? I mean, if I'm responsible for the death of 5 individuals in Colorado Springs, then you're certainly responsible for the death of 22 individuals at Sutherland Springs First Baptist. And if you're not responsible for the death of 22 individuals in Sutherland Springs First Baptist, then I'm not responsible for the death of 5 individuals at Club Q in Colorado Springs. By the way, the second one is correct. Mind blowing. Anyways, friends, we're going to go ahead and get out of here. I appreciate anybody who is here. Shalom and blessings to you all. If you appreciated this video, please remember to like and share this video, and please consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so. Hit that bell to get notified every time that we go live. We try to go live on Tuesdays and Thursdays, though sometimes it's not quite as easy as it seems. If you like this, you can also follow us on various other social media platforms. I am on Gab, Parler, and Minds, the ones I primarily recommend, as well as Twitter and Facebook. You can follow us at the Synagogue on any of those different platforms. Also, I'm dropping a link to the entire Respect for Marriage Act in the live chat, so you guys can read the whole thing for yourselves. Also, if you want to support the work we do here, you can do so either by subscribing to the Patreon, which is a monthly subscription-based service. We do not have any tiers, so you can give as much or as little as you like, or giving a one-time donation to the PayPal. Once again, no tiers, so you can give as much or as little as you like. And links to those will be floating around in the live chat as well. Please only give if you think that these shows are actually providing clarity in the absolute glut of misinformation that is the modern world. I do aim on making this a career, but obviously there is no reason I should make this a career unless I am providing good news content for you guys. Also, want to go ahead and give a special announcement here today. It's not going to start until January. We're going to wait till the start of the new year, but I am going to start, excuse me, a blog for this channel. You could consider it like a news sort of paper, I guess, or whatever. But nonetheless, we are going to have a blog called Bloglodite, like troglodyte. Think like a Neanderthal. Ha ha he he. Anyways, and it's going to be probably once a week. The first week of January will be the first week that we have it pushed forward. And it's going to allow us to talk more specifically about certain political topics that are not necessarily in the news, but are more generally political, right? Like political philosophy, economics, how we should feel about certain issues, that kind of stuff. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, stay tuned. Again, we'll be launching it in January, about a month from now. Appreciate every single one of you guys who is here. I even appreciate you, Steve, even though I don't understand why you feel the need to comment stuff that is completely irrelevant to what we're talking about. But I digress. Shalom to you all. Thank you for being here. We will probably be back on Thursday, even though it is Thanksgiving. I might do an early show. And I want to remind you guys to think like Neanderthals, always be watchdogs, and ask you guys the question, in the face of Armageddon, will you compromise